For more on Ukraine's presidential election, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Dallas is Serhiy Kudelia. He's an associate professor of political science at Baylor University. Also with us from Moscow is Pavel Felgenhauer. He's a defense analyst and columnist for Novaya Gazeta. Here in the studio is Yuval Weber. He's a senior fellow at the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute and associate professor at the Daniel Morgan Graduate School. From Tallinn, Estonia, Marko Mihkelson is the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Estonian Parliament. Welcome to all of you to the show. Serhiy Kudelia, let me start with you. So we have a television comedian who's never held a government job and has no political experience, looking like he's going to win the biggest number of votes in this Ukrainian election. How do you explain that?
So it's important to look at who the voters of Mr. Zelensky are. And about 70% of his electorate are voters under 40 years old. So this is really a new generation of Ukrainians who are telling the politicians, the established politicians, that they are not reflective, that these politicians cannot reflect the interests and the preferences of this new generation. This is the generation that does not remember the Soviet Union, or they barely remember the Soviet Union. And Mr. Zelensky is a member of that generation. So in a way, they're basically finding a person who looks like them, who talks like them, and who is capable to connect to them in a way that all politicians are not. So to a large extent, this is really an intergenerational turnover and a revolution of a young generation of Ukrainians.
Pavel Felgenhauer, if we look at Petro Poroshenko, who is the incumbent president, in 2014 he was elected with almost 55% of the vote. The fact that he couldn't get 50% this time, he's hovering around 16%. What does this tell us about him?
Oh yes, in 2014, Petro Poroshenko was elected in the first round. There were just one round of presidential elections, and it was a kind of national mandate. And since then, his popularity went down. But you have to understand that in Ukraine, basically, in 27 years of independent Ukraine, only one person, Leonid Kuchma, was the only incumbent that got a second term of presidency. All the rest were ousted, and the Mr. Yushchenko actually didn't even make it in 2010 to the second round. So it's not strange. There's nothing new in Ukraine that a ruling president becomes very unpopular and is kicked out. So actually, Mr. Poroshenko, no one even expected he'll make it to the second round, to the runoff. But he did, and he's running a rather successful campaign, so you shouldn't write him off. He is still very much in game.
Yuval Weber, as we heard from Serhiy Kudelia there's a new generation of voters now who feel that the establishment politicians are not meeting their demands right now. But Petro Poroshenko, the president, he's blaming the Kremlin and its agents and oligarchs for Vladimir Zelensky's success at the polls. Is there anything to that at all?
Well, to an extent, Mr. Poroshenko has amassed a number of rivals. He has taken a very strong anti-Russia position. One of his early campaign slogans was army, faith, and the language, each one of which was sort of against Russia in the language, in basically the faith, because Russia and Ukraine separated their churches, and of course the war that's happening in Donbass and Ukraine's, the issue of Crimea between Russia and Ukraine. So in each one of those, what Mr. Poroshenko has done is he's fallen into the pattern of basically every Ukrainian president looking for re-election. The first time, like Poroshenko and his predecessors, have gone for a broad-based appeal. But in the second time that they're going up for re-election, they've gone for a nationalist campaign. And in this particular instance, what Mr. Zelensky did is he had a very vague campaign, but it was all very positive. One of his campaign slogans, such as it were, was no promises, no disappointments. So as long as he remained above the fray, above any actual policy positions, he was able to paint Mr. Poroshenko as being angry and always basically fighting with the Russians.
But Yuval, if we look at Poroshenko's, I guess, failure here to get 50% of the vote, what was the main complaint of voters? Was it his failure to combat corruption, or was it to raise living standards? Was it to end the war?
So sort of all of the above. When Poroshenko came in, he was the one who was going to essentially advocate for Ukrainian sovereignty. He was the Euromaidan basically compromise candidate. And the idea was that if you put in a very successful businessman, that you would have an end to all of these problems, that there would be popular enthusiasm for anti-corruption, there would be some way to use the support of the West in order to bring the war to an end. And what he was not able to do was basically bring enough change. And what Mr. Zelensky has done is promise change in some sort of general way, and people have responded to that.
All right, let's go to Tallinn, to Estonia, to Marko Mihkelson. And Marko Mihkelson, Europe must be looking at this election very closely. If we look at this first round, how difficult? I mean, Ukraine has expressed a desire in the past to become a member of the European Union, to join NATO. Is that going to now be more difficult?
No, I don't think so. What has happened during this first round of presidential election, this is a very bold step forward to make Ukraine even more democratic and rule of law-based society, specifically if we compare the surrounding of Ukraine to the east, like Russia, or to north, like Belarus. So this has been a tremendous success, what we have seen during last not only 5 years, but Ukraine has sustained as on their path to become a strong democracy. And this has been recognized by European nations, and the relations and links between Europe and Ukraine today, these links are more stronger than ever.
Well, where is the evidence that Europe is now more open to Ukraine becoming a member of the EU, say, or of NATO?
You know, it's very early stages, of course, of this kind of integration, but we have to understand this year is very important for Ukraine. The presidential elections only on a halfway, but don't forget, in autumn we will have a second round of elections, and parliamentary elections this time in Ukraine are perhaps even a little bit more important than presidential ones. So I'm more than sure that Ukrainians understand that first and foremost, their own efforts and reforms are paving a way towards a more closer integration with the EU and NATO.
Serhiy Kudelia, we've heard from Ukrainians that some of their complaints against Petro Poroshenko was that he did not combat corruption, that he failed to raise living standards. But do people actually believe that Zelensky will be able to do that, or was this more of a protest vote by young people?
To an extent, it was a protest vote, I agree, but I also think that many politicians who were making promises in this election, they lost credibility with most of the voters. The Gallup poll showed that Ukraine has the lowest level of support in the government in the entire world. About 9% of Ukrainians only believe or trust their own government. So in a way, voters basically said, just minimize our intervention in our lives. Let us live in a free society without state really imposing on us or telling us which language we should speak, which websites we should access, and which television channels we can or cannot watch. Right. Because remember, apart from all the failures of Mr. Poroshenko in terms of fighting corruption, he also pursued a very ethnocratic set of policies that privileged the Ukrainian language and Ukrainian ethnicity over other languages and ethnicities. And he was accused by the European Union of adopting very discriminatory set of policies, specifically in the sphere of education and language laws. And I think this type of imposition of the state on the very multicultural, multi-ethnic society, which is essentially bilingual, has produced a backlash on the part of the public. It's important to stress that Mr. Zelensky has been speaking both Ukrainian and Russian in public sphere. In fact, he speaks more Russian than Ukrainian. He is openly bilingual in his cultural approach, and he says that minority language have to be protected. This is a major shift from the set of ethnocratic policies that Mr. Poroshenko has been pursuing over the last 5 years.
Right, and Serhiy Kudelia, you've written a piece on this. I mean, you talk about the anti-establishment sentiment on the part of voters, but you also say that Zelensky has an appeal because he offers direct rule via referendums to establish national policy, or that he's a supranational leader outside who doesn't talk of ideological differences?
Yes, in a way, this is what many populist leaders offer, is an attempt to tell the public that your voices will be heard in a very direct sense. You will be able to organize referendums on any contested issue, on any topic that you want, and I will rule through you, in a way. I will be your direct representative in the government. His first law that he promises to adopt is the law on the people's power, in which he basically is supposed to legalize these direct referendums on very important issues that deal with the future of the country. In a way, I think that's part of his appeal, is to basically tell the state, voters are trying to tell the state that you need to move away and let us directly rule through Mr. Zelensky. Of course, that's a utopian goal. It's very unrealistic, but in a way, I think that's the direction that Ukraine is taking right now.
Pavel Felgenhauer, looking at this first round, looking at the results that we know so far, how difficult will it be for Petro Poroshenko to prevail in that second round poll?
I'm afraid it's totally unpredictable, the result of the second round. There's going to be apparently a debate between the two, the incumbent and the challenger, Zelensky. That may sway the opinion. Zelensky, yes, he's more of his voters are the Russian kind of speaking parts of Ukraine, more to the east. Poroshenko right now will be most likely the sole candidate of the more western part of Ukraine, more nationalistic part. And it's a kind of been a split that was always part of almost any Ukrainian election. And right now it's not easy to predict how it's going to work out. Also because quite a number of Russian-speaking parts of Ukraine are not taking part in this election. Crimea is now Russian. The Donbass is not taking part in the election. So right now, it's both Poroshenko and Zelensky have a chance. It's not yet decided. But even if Zelensky doesn't become the new president, he's formed a new party. He has support. And he's going to be running that party into the new Rada election in the fall. And of course, in Ukraine, the Rada, the parliament, has more power than the president, and he's going to be a power broker, apparently. And of course, he's not just simply a comedian, he's a satirist, and he made his business, his career on mocking Poroshenko. And so that makes him, I mean, if not a politician, but he's, of course, a political animal anyway.
Yuval, talking about power brokers, the former Prime Minister, Yulia Tymoshenko, one of the better-known names in Ukrainian politics, she got 13% of the vote. We have to remember that there were a number of other parties, a number of other people who ran for this election. How important will it be for the runoff election where she throws her support?
Oh, totally. In the sense that Mr. Zelensky won about 30% and Mr. Poroshenko won about 18% in the first round. So where Yulia Tymoshenko and a few other of the people going fourth, who is a person named Yuri Boyko, who is really the most outspoken advocate for the Russian minority in the East. So where people like these throw their support is going to be decisive. And it's likely that most of them will either they cut deals in order to support Poroshenko, or the more natural second preference of people in the exit polls all showed that they would be willing to support Zelensky over Poroshenko in a second round. And what that really coalesces is this is the anti-Poroshenko, anti-establishment vote in the second way.
Yeah, but I'm wondering, is that enough for Zelensky to prevail? Because as we heard right at the beginning of the program, 70% of voters under the age of 40 voted for Zelensky. I mean, is he going to be able to expand his voter base beyond that?
Well, what's going to be difficult is really when it gets to, as one of the previous guests mentioned, that there's going to be a series of debates, and there's going to be a lot more focus on what the policy positions of Zelensky are. Interestingly, he did not have any campaign rallies during this the first round, nor did he really have any slogans. He didn't really engage in politics itself. His campaigning was mostly limited to very positive, very sunny videos that went on social media. Yeah. So as soon as it really gets to the big questions, when he talks about, generally speaking, reintegration of Donbass, getting Crimea back, ending corruption, these are all very positive slogans, and everyone wants to hear basically what he actually means by that. And as soon as he actually has a plan or advertises what the type of policy preferences that he has are, then he could really take a lot of these protest votes. But if it just looks like he's going to be, a puppet of others or just allow the people to rule, then Poroshenko's main sort of line of attack against him is, you may not like me, but at least you'll know that I'll actually be ruling day to day. Whereas my opponent, he's actually, young and charming, very good speaker, but he doesn't have much to say. And if he doesn't have much to say, then other people will fill it in for him.
Marko, Mihkelson, of course, Ukraine faces a number of problems, but, Crimea always looms large when we talk about Ukraine. Here's the Foreign Minister, Anton Klimkin. This is what he had to say about that. Let's watch.
Crimea was taken away from Crimeans. Their homeland was taken away from them. It is well understood that the international community will never recognize this. We feel pain every day for this. I believe that the sooner Russia starts direct negotiations, I emphasize direct negotiations on the occupation, the better it will be for Russia and, of course, for occupied Crimea. Under Russian occupation, Crimea goes nowhere. It simply has no future.
That was Pavel Klimkin. Marko, Mihkelson, have you heard any of these candidates articulate a policy on Crimea?
I can't see any change in terms of approach from European nations or NATO countries, not recognizing annexation of Crimea by Russia Federation, and also ongoing war against Ukraine in Donbass, in eastern part of Ukraine. This is something what we should not also forget about when we're talking about current political climate and debates within Ukraine. But what is most important, having these problems, and enormous problems actually for a country as Ukraine is, then to have very competitive and free and democratic elections, as we have witnessed this time in Ukraine, this is a very strong signal that Ukraine is ready to move forward. And also today is also an important day in a way that the friendship, so-called friendship agreement between Ukraine and the Russian Federation from 1997 is, how to say, is stopped and or is part of history. Anyway, there should be the new page also in the future in relations between Ukraine and Russia.
Serhiy Kudelia, the other big issue in Ukraine, that of course is the war in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. 13,000 people have been killed so far in this conflict. Have you heard anything in this election campaign from any of the candidates that tells us that things could change after the election?
Well, there were no specifics, but there are several important policy positions that Zelensky articulated. One of them is he ruled out military option. He said that there is no way he was going to use force to try to recapture these territories back. The second important position that he articulated is that he says we need to speak to people in Donbass, in occupied areas of Donbass, in their own language, speak to them in Russian and appeal to their immediate needs and preferences so that we can more effectively communicate why Ukraine is still interested in them. And that's a major shift, again, from what Poroshenko has been doing. Because, again, Poroshenko's very nationalistic positions, to an extent, alienated even people who are willing to come back and return to Ukraine. I think the change from Poroshenko to Zelensky, if Zelensky actually is elected president in the second round, it will actually create an opening for the resolution of the conflict, because suddenly we will have a leader in Ukraine who is not associated with the counterterrorism operation, with many of the collateral damage, with many of the civilians that were killed as a result of that fighting. He is not hated by Eastern Ukrainians. He actually is capable to relate to these people in Eastern Ukraine. And I think in a way he can actually win the Hearts and Minds campaign if he is serious about waging that type of campaign to win Donbass back. Finally, one of the other positions of Mr. Zelensky is to bring the United States and the United Kingdom to the negotiation table and use their leverage to get some concessions from Russia, particularly on the withdrawal of troops and early elections. This is something that he favors, and this is something that the United States, at least Kurt Volker, the U.S. representative on Donbass, he showed that the United States will be willing to consider that kind of an offer from Ukraine.
Pavel Felgenhauer, would Russia favor a Zelensky win at the polls in the runoff election?
Well, obviously so. Moscow doesn't want Poroshenko. That was said not only in the Russian state-run TV programs, it was said by the Kremlin and the other top officials that Ukraine may disintegrate if Poroshenko is reelected. We won't talk to him. And so, yes, a new face there in Kiev, a new president with whom Moscow would try to negotiate and get what Moscow wants from Kiev. And Moscow actually really wants for Ukraine to renounce its ideas of moving towards NATO, European Union also, but mostly it's NATO problem. That's the main problem for Russia. Zelensky said that he wants to run a referendum, which may go either ways right now. Poroshenko organized the change in the constitution, putting NATO membership as a national goal. If Zelensky moves away from that position, wiggles away from that position through a referendum, that would be very much seen as a positive move in Moscow, and that could facilitate Russia being more willing to go forward and pacify the Donbass. But of course that depends on will Zelensky win, and will he have enough power in Kiev to actually, if not change the direction of Ukrainian policy, foreign policy, but at least to modify it, to stop the confrontation with Russia, as Russia understands it, of course.
Marko, Mihkelson, how will, I guess, policymakers in Washington and in Brussels at NATO headquarters see something like that if Ukraine has a referendum on NATO membership, if Ukrainians reject NATO membership, and then we have some kind of a grand bargain, a grand deal that will bring peace to the eastern portions of Ukraine?
First of all, this is entirely the matter of Ukrainians and Ukrainian leaders, politicians, to decide about their choices, both for integration with Europe or their choices about security arrangements or guarantees. And but I'm very cautious to say that this is the only reason why we have a conflict in eastern Ukraine and occupation, annexation of Crimea. We have to look more deeper into this, and this is not only about Zelensky or about Poroshenko or near future. The Russia's interest, as far as we could understand from here, is basically total control over political choices of Ukraine. And this is very difficult to imagine for a country who has gone through all these dramatic moments during the last 5 years. Ukrainians have lost more than 10,000 people in this war.
Yuval, one final point, and that is Crimea. As Pavel Felgenhauer told us earlier in the show, people there were not able to vote or were unwilling to vote in this election. How much of an impact does that have?
Well, in a sense, the people of Crimea don't live in Ukraine anymore.
Right.
Because the Russian Federation has exerted its sovereignty over it. And so in terms of the electoral politics, people in Crimea, people in Donbass where the conflict is actually happening, don't get to vote. So essentially that pro-Russia voice, which got about 10% in the first round, would have actually been much higher had those people still been in Ukraine.
Right.
And so in terms of what is the larger strategic issue here, the Russians have said up and down, from President Putin down all the way, is that they will never give back Crimea under any circumstances. So when people like Zelensky say, we'll sit down for negotiations, the Russian response is, we don't negotiate about things that don't belong to other people. Right. It's ours and nothing else. Yeah. So really what it comes down to is the Russian side has been waiting for the Poroshenko nationalist position to collapse, and hopefully to collapse for internal reasons. What Poroshenko has been waiting, and the reason that he's been advocating basically the status quo, just keep at it, don't deviate, is that hopefully Russia collapses, and that both sides are waiting for the other side to collapse, so when they have a grand bargain, it'll be more towards their preferences versus not.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.